Thank you everybody for tuning in and taking time out of your day to listen to this presentation on definitely my favourite topic, project planning and control. But not so much just project planning and control, but the opportunity to help improve project performance by using project planning and control. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about today, to start with, I'll just give a bit of an outline as to why we need project planning and control. Secondly, I'll explain exactly what project planning and control is, because it's a funny sort of an area, and often different people from different backgrounds will have a different sort of expectation or perception of what project planning and control actually involves. I'll provide a bit of an overview of project planning and controls training and certification, and in particular recommend one particular type that I've found to be fairly good. And then at the end, we can have a question and answer session as well. So if you do have any questions that you come up with or queries along the way, if you could type them in through the chat box, then we'll try to have some time at the end where I can go through some of those questions as well. So to start with, what is project planning and control? Well, I like to take the perception that it's more so than just being about individual pieces of information and data, that it really is a synchronized process where timing is everything. So it really requires a lot of coordination to make sure that the right information, or firstly, the right things are being measured, and then the right information is flowing through at the right time so that it can be meaningful and helpful for the project team. So in order to do that, it requires leadership, just like a conductor, for example, leading an orchestra. It requires control, similarly something that the conductor is going to be doing with an orchestra. And it doesn't just involve the orchestra, obviously it involves plans, just like the music sheets that the musicians are working from, tools and different instruments that you can use. And of course you need a skilled workforce to be able to make all of that come together to improve the performance of your project. So looking at the more clinical definition, if you like, so project planning is the process of identifying the methods, resources and activities necessary to accomplish the project's objectives. So that's the planning aspect, whereas the project control involves the process of monitoring project performance and forecasts and providing continuous feedback to stakeholders. So it's largely about setting a plan and then giving continuous feedback and communication to the project team. So the application of project controls is really an example of the PDCA cycle, which stands for planning, doing, checking, then acting, and recycling in that process. So it's really a continuous improvement process that's been adopted from the total quality management philosophy. So project controls is really a quality management process in itself. So the whole idea is that you plan what you're going to do, you then perform the activities, or the project team performs the activities. You check and measure how they're performing. And then from that information, different actions will be taken so that the plan will change and the project team will continuously adjust what it's doing to make the project successful. So that's the continuous feedback cycle. And that's almost like, you know, the central nervous system of the project, that it's continuously feeding back performance and progress so that it continuously make adjustments and overcome risks. Now, the other great thing about project controls is that it's integrated. So rather than different teams working in different silos, for example, scheduling over here, the finance team over here, a contracts team working independently, it brings teams together to have that one single source of that truth, and that unified reporting and that unified story for the project. So the other great thing about being it brings all of those disciplines together and really helps make the project team function better. So an example of pulling the data together from project controls perspective is this very simple sort of a project here, calling it Project X. And we've got a graph here that might be showing performance on the project. And the black line is showing cumulatively how much, or what the baseline plan was for the project. So you can see from January through to December, the baseline plan involved $100,000 worth of investment in the project. And when we look at the red line, which is our actual costs, it's showing how much expenditure, how many actual costs we've had up until the month of July. So in this project, it looks like it was originally planned to finish in December, and it's currently in July, and its expenditure has spent or in the vicinity of $50,000. So if you were to ask to have a look at this performance report and make an assessment of as to how the project's going, what would you come up with? What would your thoughts be? It's quite interesting. A very common response to this is to assume that because the red line is below the black line, because we're spending less than the original plan, perhaps that suggests that we're going well and that we're working really efficiently. Maybe we can even forecast that we're not going to spend as much as we thought we would. So that's not actually the case. So that might be an assumption that you'd make if you were just tracking costs independently. But if you actually integrate and measure the progress that you're making, as shown with the green line in this graph, or earned value, you can see that the amount of progress that we've made is actually significantly less than what we'd originally planned, and it's significantly less than how much we've spent. So suddenly, by having this integrated project controls approach, the richness of the data is giving us so much more information. Instead of going off blindly thinking that we're not spending as much as we'd anticipated, suddenly it can send those early warning signals that for some reason we seem to be spending more than we'd originally anticipated. And people can then investigate, understand the problem, and take corrective actions as necessary. So why would we use project controls on a project? So there's so many benefits from project controls, but to summarize a few of them, firstly, it's that continuous feedback on work progress and productivity. So it's, once again, it's like that central nervous system. You're continuously getting feedback on how things are going and are able to adjust. Early identification of performance trends and root causes. So rather than drifting along and not realizing problems, they're brought to your attention much earlier, and it gives the project manager the opportunity to make decisions, make changes, get extra resources or whatever it is that they need to correct the problem. It also improves transparency and reduces the risk of disputes. So one of the other great things about project controls is you're naturally creating a historical record of the project. So as you go through, you're tracking, measuring, you're keeping records of what the root causes of problems were. This becomes an excellent historical record, and it's also going to help reduce the risk of a dispute or a disagreement between a contractor and an owner, for example. It improves the forecasting, planning, and recruiting of key resources. So from the data that you have on how you're tracking, you can help use that to project out and forecast, for example, how many resources you might need, or any particular peaks and troughs in your resourcing, so that you can level it out and optimize your plans a little bit more. And as I mentioned earlier, it produces historical data that isn't just used in the event of disputes or anything like that, but it can be put into a historical database or used to improve estimates on future projects and those sorts of things. So for so many good reasons, near term, like for executing the project, as well as long term, creating that historical database and those lessons learned, there's so many good reasons to have a good project controls practice in place. And so all that being said, how do we actually know as a fact that project planning and control really works? So it's been one of those anecdotal things where when you're on a project and you have good project planning and control, you kind of know that the project's going well and performing well, but how can you actually prove that? For a long time, there wasn't really any proof of that, but there's a group called Independent Project Analysis, or IPA, that have actually been doing a lot of benchmarking and data crunching on projects from around the world from a variety of industries. And what they've done is they've identified a number of different practices or attributes about projects that increase the likelihood or have a strong correlation with the likelihood of those projects being successful. And it's quite interesting because of those 8 practices that they identified a clear correlation, 6 out of 8 of those are typical or standard functions of a project planning and control process. So for example, building an integrated and resource-loaded schedule is a fundamental component of integrated planning and control. And negotiating strong audit rights, so being able to review a contractor's progress, for example. Using the estimate for project controls. So once again, that's about taking the original estimate and putting that into a plan that's set as a baseline for monitoring the project. Using physical progressing or methods of measurement, as they might be called. So having an objective method for measuring progress on the project. Reporting status frequently by discipline or by team. And closing out, as we mentioned earlier. So maintaining that historical cost and schedule performance data and keeping that record to improve estimating on future projects. So aside from all those reasons, so even at executive level, there's another good reason to practice project controls. So in 2002, following the Enron collapse, the US Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And the effect of that act is to hold CEOs and CFOs of publicly traded companies criminally liable for fraud relating to shareholders. So this is all about the project itself being an investment. So you're taking all that funding and it's actually being invested. So it's really important from an accountability perspective that the project is tracked and measured accurately for financial reporting reasons and those sorts of things. So executives can no longer plead ignorance of company status. So there's so many good reasons to have a good project controls mechanism in place to help reduce that risk. Proven auditing practices are required, and there must be integrity and timeliness in the data reported. So more recently, there's been another act passed in the US for the Program Management Improvement and Accountability Act to improve accountability and best practices in government. So all of these things are having the effect of lifting the bar so that more and more projects are being treated like investments that should be tracked and measured and forecast objectively. So there's so many good reasons from a practitioner level right up to executive compliance level for why we should practice good project controls. But how do we actually go about it? It can be quite a challenge because organisations can be very complex. You can have all sorts of different stakeholders with different information needs, all sorts of different inputs. You might have contractors or subcontractors or vendors with different work breakdown structures or different ways of doing their work, different cultures and all of those sorts of things. So somehow, how can you take all of that information and all of those information needs and turn it into a good, robust project control system that's going to be a real help and a complement to your project management team rather than being an administrative burden? So there's a number of ways to go about it, and the best that I've seen in terms of organising the key functions that you need to do well is this model that I've put on the slide here, which is actually from APM in the UK. It involves breaking down the elements of project planning and control into three key areas. So the first one being definition. So definition being about understanding the original business case or the why that we're performing the project in detail. So understanding the benefits that are being delivered, the costs and the schedule. So understanding the scope of the project. Obviously that's of critical importance. Understanding and managing the requirements associated with the project and stakeholder management. So that's the first key area. Then the next key area is planning or project planning. So once again, that involves breakdown structures. So breakdown structures involve things like the work breakdown structure, the organisation breakdown structure, dependency management, so effectively identifying and tracking the dependency between different activities, cost estimating, and that's cost and resource estimating, budgeting, and then handover and closeout. So what is the overall outcome that we're delivering? And how is that going to be handed over to the satisfaction of the customer? And so the whole idea is that you start your planning process with that in mind. Then the last section is the monitoring and control. So the monitoring and control is more about the drumbeat. So this, like I say, it's the central nervous system of the project. This is how are we going to have a cyclical method where we're very cleanly and quickly informing the project of the status and the problems and helping identify things as we execute. So this area is broken into a number of different knowledge modules. Firstly, establishing the baseline, which is really just the benchmark against which the project is going to get measured. Having a change management process. So change does happen, and it's really important to know that change is going to happen, anticipate that, and have a robust method for dealing with that change as it comes through. Performance reporting, once again, understanding who your different stakeholders are and what their information needs are, and developing your monitoring and control process so that all of those information needs will be satisfied. Risk management being a key area. So there's all of the known things that are built into the schedule, but how are we going to deal with all of those unknown things, all of those uncertainties that we could have to deal with. Cost control, as mentioned earlier, so understanding what your funding levels are, understanding what your budget is, and understanding what your actual costs are. Forensic analysis, which is about being able to create a record so that if required, you can go back and have a very detailed understanding of what's happened on the project. And of course, short-term planning. We spoke a little bit earlier about longer-term planning. So short-term planning is more about that detailed planning, looking in the near time frame and developing a more detailed plan. And last but not least, record keeping. So as we go through, we should be leaving that historical footprint so that overall your project controls process should be like a time-lapse camera of the project, so that you're recording this imprint of where you are, whatever your reporting cycle is. So if it's month end, you're creating those historical records as you traverse through the project. So moving along firstly to the definition section. So I'll walk through those three sections. So definition, planning, monitoring and control, but starting with definition, it's probably best described by this slide here. So if you have a look at that cartoon image there, try to get a bit of a handle on what you think might be going on. And then if you read the wording, so suddenly a heated exchange took place between the king and the project manager. So something's gone wrong in the definition or the requirements and the scoping of this project. So what was the overall objective? So was it to dig a ditch next to the castle wall or to defend the castle from attack? Okay, so you can see here, quite obviously, somebody's written the requirements in a particular way that's taken away the overall intended outcome. And now the contractor's gone in, they've built their ditch next to the castle wall. They've satisfied the requirements, but the overall outcome is not going to be particularly attractive for the king, particularly if they find themselves under attack anytime soon. So that's the essence of the definition phase. It's about making sure that the business case is really well understood, that the scope management is really understood, so that as the project gets scoped, there's a clear definition there. Requirements are managed really effectively so that the overall intended outcome or the requirement is really well understood, and that there's an effective stakeholder management process in place so that all of the key stakeholders are engaged in the process and having influence into the actual definition of the project. So this diagram here, I really like this diagram here as well because it shows in one picture just how important that project definition phase is. So this is showing on the y-axis, it's showing the amount of value that can be generated by your project. And at the end of the day, the reason we're doing these projects is to generate value. They are an investment. And the schematic shows you a range of possible outcomes between doing the project poorly or defining the project poorly or defining the project well. And you can see that as we work through the red, the yellow, and the green early phases of the project where we're in definition, there's a really wide gap that emerges between poor project definition and good project definition. So what that's telling us is in the early phases of the project, we have a really great opportunity to add value to the project by defining it really effectively. Once we go into execute, our opportunity to influence the outcomes is significantly less. So you can see the divergence of the green and the blue lines. Once we're mature, we have a lot less opportunity. We can still influence the outcome. We can still improve productivity and performance, but it's really that definition phase that is fundamentally the most important. So in project planning and control, the more involvement we can have in that, the more that we can help project managers get that right, by far the greater value that's likely to be delivered by the project. So what is planning? So we've spoken a little bit about planning, but what is it really? And I think the best way to describe it, or the best way I like to think about it, is that it's not that much different to any sort of forecasting. So you could go from the extreme of staring into a crystal ball and expecting to get an outcome, or you can go through a planning process that helps you lay out how that future might look, helps you gain some consensus from people. And even though whatever is planned, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be exactly what the future is. It gives you a bit of a compass that teams can work towards that's going to be more likely to lead to a good outcome. So using this APMG or APM model, they've broken down planning into its core elements into some nice bite-sized chunks. And it's pretty much, they start off with an introduction, giving the overall philosophy, as I mentioned. The next step is breakdown structures, and this would definitely be, certainly from my experience, the area that project teams fall down in most. And it's about breaking down your project into manageable chunks, but organising it in a way that's really helpful for the project. So doing things such as a work breakdown structure, which is all about breaking down the work, the doing stuff. So breaking it down by the work that'll get done. We also talk about product breakdown structures, which are about the final asset that will be delivered by the project. So breaking down the things, the products that are being produced by the project. There's also cost breakdown structures and a number of other structures that can be used just to help give you structure and discipline, but also help you in that analysis phase when you're trying to understand where things might be going well or where things might be going a little bit pear-shaped. The next one is dependency management. And this is another key area as well. So it's a fundamental part of planning and scheduling, is to get the relationships between the different activities, but in particular when there's handover points between different teams who might be responsible for elements of the work as well. Cost estimating being a really important part as well. So cost estimating is about breaking down the work and allocating resources, but it's also about assessing the risk. So particularly during the planning stage, there might be a fairly high level of uncertainty in terms of different areas, and putting some framing around those risks and understanding how those risks will be managed. So from that estimating process, we then develop a budget for the work, and the budget is the benchmark against which we measure the project performance. So the budget is a little bit different to funding, which is the amount of money that will be available. It's actually the benchmark target that we set for allocating resources to the project. And then lastly, but definitely not least, as I mentioned, handover and closeout. So as we're going through the planning process, it's really important to start with the end in mind. So start with a vision of how that project is going to eventually be handed over to the customer, so that it's going to be meet all of their exit criteria for the overall project, and starting with that in mind and working backwards. So this is an example of the breakdown structures that are developed on a project, and this one's particularly nice to develop at the start of a project, because it really helps you identify where you've got, where you might have gaps in your overall scoping of the project, or where there might be double ups. And it's a very simple matrix, but all it does is it takes the work breakdown structure, which is that gradual decomposition of the work down into work packages or manageable chunks. And then on the left-hand side, you can see we have the OBS, or the organisation breakdown structure. So by simply breaking out that work and then mapping it against the different organisational elements that are responsible, suddenly you've helped improve the scoping of the project, you've identified any gaps or overlaps that you might have, and you've improved accountability, because suddenly you've put different organisational elements as responsible for delivery of those different WBS components. Now, this is another interesting picture as well. So this is describing rolling wave planning. So without worrying too much about of the detailed acronyms in this slide, the key thing, or the key takeaway to get from this, is that projects aren't set in stone, particularly if they're complex projects or they're long duration projects. So it really is something of a discovery, where there's progressive elaboration quite often throughout a project. So you can see the red line marking time now. You can see a few months in advance of time now, there's a good granularity. So the light blue squares, they're representative of work packages that have been broken down into a great deal of detail. And in the slightly darker blue boxes, they are what are referred to, moving a little bit further out from the timeline, say 3 to 6 months, for example. The boxes are dark blue, and they're much larger. They're what are commonly referred to as planning packages. So the whole idea is that if you're on a complex project where the exact detail of how you're going to execute isn't known, you progressively work your way through the project, breaking down those darker blue larger chunks of work into more detailed work packages as you progress along. And this type of approach is really handy, particularly when you're dealing with more agile projects or software development projects and things like that, where it can be quite challenging to try to detail plan out anything that's in the, say, the medium to long term. Okay, so we've covered the definition phase of a project, and we've also gone through the planning. The next section I'll go through is the monitoring and control, which once again, this is really taking that PDCA, that total quality management process, and applying it to the control. So the idea being everything we do, we plan, then we do, we check, and then we take actions, and it's that continuous feedback loop for the project. So once again, for this process, the APM have divided this up into a really tidy little set of bite-sized chunks or knowledge areas. Firstly, it's the baseline is the first knowledge area, and that is really, particularly up front in a project, is a real opportunity to get stakeholders together, to have that collaboration and to develop that sort of agreed sense of how we're going to execute the plan. So this will often be referred to as a PMB or a performance measurement baseline. The next module is performance reporting. So performance reporting really is about communication. So it's about understanding what matters most and then measuring whatever matters most and having a really nice, tidy way of getting that information out to your key stakeholders. And I think the key thing with performance reporting is to think about that right at the start. So when you're building your plans, when you're organising your data, think of how that your stakeholders might like to see that rolled up. So you might have some senior level stakeholders who might want to see very summary level reporting or summary level KPIs, whereas the project teams themselves, they might want to see more detail about particular interfaces they have or something else like that. The next one being cost control. Obviously, everything that we're doing on the project is an investment of resources and costs. So being able to track the productivity or the CPI, the cost performance index on your project is really critical as well. Short-term planning, and this is a little bit related to that rolling wave process that I showed earlier, but the whole idea being that whatever is in the near term, you can with a lot more certainty plan that out in detail and get a shared understanding between project teams on what work they're doing. The change management process, this is a real key, and this is another one of those tricky ones that often falls between the cracks, but is really, really important because firstly, it protects the project from any unwanted scope. So you don't want engineers inadvertently going off and doing something that they might think is a really good idea, but it might be out of scope of the project. You also want to have different criteria so that you can make sure the right people are involved and the right people are approving and endorsing those changes. Risk management is definitely one of the most interesting areas in monitoring and control. So this is all of the uncertain stuff and having a systematic method for identifying it, quantifying it where possible, and then having methods and mitigations in place for reducing that risk. Forensic analysis being another one, but hopefully something that you don't need to do too often because the whole philosophy with project controls is it's about forecasting and trying to help project managers make the best decisions for what's remaining on the project. Occasionally, if there is a dispute or a disagreement, you might be in that forensic analysis space where you actually have to go back and do the forensic and look at what happened and try to resolve any disputes or anything like that. And lastly, record keeping. So keeping those records so that you have that assurance for the project. It's going to be helpful for audits, and most of all, it's going to help future estimating on projects if you've got that historical record that you've left behind. So we've covered or why project controls is good, and we've gone through a lot of the knowledge areas from the APMG certification model. There's also planning, project planning and control training and certification that's now available in Australia. So it is quite a new area. And one of the interesting things about project planning and control is all of us, including myself, kind of just fall into the profession. So there is no university or TAFE course for project planning and control. So it's long been a bugbear of mine where to find sort of standardization and benchmarks for certification or for where graduates, for example, can learn the right way to do it, and people can become certified to demonstrate their competency. So I was very, very lucky to come across this project planning control training and certification module from the UK, from the APM group over there. It's a very much an introductory type of thing, and it's referred to as the foundation in project control. So it's a 3-day course covering all of the knowledge areas that I've gone through in the presentation today. And then for a more advanced version, which I would say is probably suitable to somebody with at least 3 to 4 years experience, there's also a practitioner level certification as well. So I found these to be really good. So if you're, in particular, if you're in a project where you're at a mediocre level of maturity and you're wanting to grab something that's tried and trusted and true and jump to a fairly good grounding very quickly, then something like this, to me, has its advantages there. It's been very popular in the UK, so though it is starting to take off in Australia, in the UK it's growing very rapidly because they have that similar scenario over there where there is a bit of a gap in terms of competencies in project planning control. And this exact certification actually grew by 34% in the UK last year. So I'm expecting that a similar sort of trend will probably happen in Australia with a bit of a lag afterwards as well. Now the actual guide itself is actually based on a textbook from APM called Planning, Scheduling, Monitoring and Control. So it's the practical project management of time, cost and risk. And so this, once again, is an excellent foundation level project planning and control manual. So it was developed by the APM group, or APM in the UK, and I actually was very lucky to meet the author. And the whole way that it's written is, at the time he had a daughter, Emily, who was 12 years old, and he said that in every single trap that his sort of compass while he was writing the book was to make it simple enough that she would be able to understand it. So it is a really great entry-level text in terms of having good simplified language, but breaking it down to hit all of those knowledge areas, including the ones we just went through in the presentation. And as part of the process as well, so there's a certificate, as I mentioned earlier, and the foundation certificate is a fairly simple process that involves 50 multiple choice questions. And there's 40 minutes allowed with a variety of different text styles and so forth, and the pass mark is 50%. And for the practitioner level certification, so it covers the same knowledge areas, but it goes into a little bit more depth. So there's a wider variety of questions, 180 minutes, so the duration is a little bit longer, and it's open book as well. So you're able to take that textbook in with you, and you're able to use simple non-programmable calculators. And another good reason for having this webinar around now is we're actually looking at running the course. So the course is going to be piloted or launched in Canberra from the 9th to the 11th for the foundation level. Now there's no prerequisites for the foundation level. So anybody who's with an interest in project planning control is eligible to do the foundation training. And then there is the practitioner training, including exam as well, which will happen the following 2 days. So for the practitioner, the prerequisite for that is the foundation. So you are able to enroll for both, or you can enroll for the foundation, but you wouldn't be able to enroll for the practitioner unless you'd done the foundation in advance.
Well, Laurie, I might just jump in there as well, just to add that, yeah, we're really excited to have these courses about to launch at DDLS. And if people would like some information about that, they're welcome to go to our website, www.ddls.com.au. And that's going to take place, as you said, in Canberra. For those people outside of Canberra, they're welcome to get in touch with DDLS. We'll have some contact details on the final slide, and we'll be happy to talk to you more about those courses, but very exciting. So, Laurie, I think we've reached a point now where we might like to think about some questions. You finished
Yes,
your
sure.
contact? Yep. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Just while people are perhaps typing up some questions for me, and please just go right ahead and type those now into the chat panel. We'll be happy to address those accordingly. Yeah, I'd like to just say thank you so much. Really fascinating content, really valuable information, and you know, really versatile as well. I think anyone who's been working on a project would find that really useful. Okay, I'm just waiting here to have some questions come through, and while we're doing that, I will just mention too that at the end of the session, we are recording this session, and at the end of it, our recording will go onto our YouTube channel, so that you'll be able to access it there, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you'll get a recording of this event shortly. I've had some comments come through that it was a great presentation, Laurie. So well done. I've got a question here actually. I think we're ready to go with one. If you're ready after all that talking.
Yes, no, I'm ready. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Welcome any questions.
Fantastic. Well, the first question here is, I've only been doing project control for 3 months. Would the foundation course be suitable?
Yeah, absolutely. So the foundation would be perfectly suited to somebody who's in that early phase of understanding project controls. It would be ideal. The actual terminology itself, the foundation is exactly what it creates. And so if I could go back in my career and do a course early to give me a good broad grounding in the key concepts, then something like this would be ideal, which is why I'm here today. So yeah, absolutely, it would be ideal in that scenario.
Okay, and we've got quite a few questions, so I'll be quick. The question following that one was, how advanced is that particular course?
So the foundation one is not very advanced. So it is something that pulls together the the elementary concepts and would be suitable for somebody who's new to project controls, who wants to understand project controls more, a fresh graduate who might be getting into a role or something like that. So the practitioner level course does leap up a little bit in the analysis and some of those sort of elements. But for the foundation, it's not advanced. It's about getting those foundation concepts. So there are no prerequisites other than having a desire to learn more about project planning and control.
Okay. Another question, capturing actual data is difficult in Middle East projects. What is your suggestion?
Okay, so so I'm not sure about the Middle East context or what it is about that geographic area that makes it more difficult. But certainly in my experience, the key element is to having a really well agreed upfront method for accruing costs at the end of each month. And if that method for accruing cost can be synchronized with your method for measuring progress on a project, it's really, really helpful for project control. So at the end of every month, you collect your actual costs. And for those who aren't familiar with accruing, there might be all of this other work that's in progress that you have received an invoice for which hasn't been approved, or you may not have received an invoice for, but you want to account for it. Having a method up front so that you can perform those accruals. So you might have a requirement for your contractor to give you some form of pro forma invoice or some other forecast of what their anticipated invoice value is. And if you can do that, it really does help you close out that month-end cycle and make your project controls data a lot more accurate and meaningful.
Right, thank you. We do have quite a number of questions coming through, so if people can be patient, we are definitely getting to them, but thank you for sending them through. What best forecasting method would you recommend to maintain consistency in estimate at completion?
So that's really interesting. It really depends on the project actually. So if you're on a very labour-intensive, complex project, for example, then so if the majority of your cost is coming from labour resources, then measuring productivity on your labour resources as you're executing. So measuring your cost performance index, which basically tells you your efficiency. And then you can use that data to project out your forecast is definitely the best method. And the best way to describe that is like a run rate in cricket. So in limited overs cricket, you have your run rate and then your forecast run rate. So if you can take your current run rate and then apply that, and that's a very good method of forecasting. If it's a more bespoke sort of a project where you haven't got this continuous large workforce, then bottom up estimate to complete is the best method to use. And there's a whole wide variety in between. So it really does depend on the nature of your project and things like that. But there's statistical techniques that can be used, bottom up estimating, a wide variety to choose from.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope that's answered that question for you. The next question that we have is, do we need this tight control and monitoring when a project is small, say developing a software with one stakeholder and developer?
Yeah, so that's a really good question as well. And I look at almost everything that we do in life is like a project. So if I'm making a sandwich, yeah, it's a project. I've probably got a timeline or a deadline. I've got resources and I've got processes that I'm going to use. But you know what? It's low risk. It's pretty simple. So I'm not going to make a project control system for that. It really is. It should be in parallel with the level of investment and the level of risk that you've got. So if once projects start getting up over 100K and they get up to $1 million and then start going beyond that, that's when you really start to get serious about having a nice simple process for informing you, so that the risk of not investing money wisely is known, so that you can continuously see how much bang for buck that you're getting. When you're to the point that you really need to know that, that's when you really want to invest in a good project control system.
Okay, I think I've got questions everywhere. It's fantastic. You've really prompted a lot of interest. Now, have we had this one? What is the best forecasting method you recommend to maintain consistency in estimate at the completion? We've had that one, haven't we? I think you've been through that.
We've had that one.
Yep, so that's a repeat there. Maybe, right, I think we've got one here. Sorry, bear with me. I'm a project accountant. Could I do the course?
Definitely, yeah. So I definitely recommend it for project accountants, or if you're a scheduler who hasn't had much integration with the financial side of things, or any of those sort of integrated groups. So the key groups that normally get pulled together in integrated project controls are scheduling, project accountants, contracts administrators. I highly recommend it, because the overall effect of integrated project controls is that those two groups come together, and a lot of the silos get broken down, and the overall outcome is typically a much better outcome. So instead of the finance team working to their drumbeat using their structures, and the scheduling team building schedules in a totally different language, and then the contracts guy, talking in another language, suddenly the teams come together, communication improves, overall outcomes improve. So yeah, definitely for a project accountant, and project accountants make great project controls people once they get the opportunity to sort of work in that sort of project control sense.
Okay, now another question we have here: the cost of controlling cost should not be the benefits achieved. Hence, how can we proportionate it? Would you like me to repeat that one?
I think I got the essence of it. So
Yep.
this is one of the trickiest things. So what I think I got out of it is that the costs. There are costs associated with the project controls aspect. So how can that be a benefit to the project?
It's saying that it should not be the benefits achieved. Hence, how can we proportion it?
Okay, yeah. So not exactly sure what the meaning is to proportionate, but what the intent of project controls is that the amount of resources invested in project controls is way less than the benefit that you can get, particularly once your projects start to get large and complex. So when projects are large and complex, it's decision making and having the right information for key decision makers becomes a lot more critical, and can be very expensive if the wrong decisions are made, and can be very advantageous if the right ones are being made. So the benefit in terms of improved investment outcome far outweighs the costs on those larger ones. You can get right down to the simplest project in the world, making a sandwich, and that's where the cost of a project control system wouldn't be worth it, obviously. So there's a bit of a sliding scale there.
Great. Well, I think we've answered all of the questions now, and please, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to contact us at DDLS or contact Laurie, and we'd be happy to pursue those. As you leave the session today, there'll be a short survey on today's webinar. If you could please complete the survey, we'd really appreciate that, as your insights will help us to shape, future events that we can put on for you. We'll send you a link to the recording of this event within the next couple of weeks, along with the details of the special offer mentioned, or the course, sorry, mentioned. If you want more information on the course that we've spoken about, the PP&C courses, or any of our courses, please, as I say, visit our website at www.ddls.com.au. And I think, Laurie, if you just go to that last slide there, we have some contact details as well that people can follow up and contact us there if they would like to. So, Laurie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolutely fascinating session. It's evoked a lot of discussion and a lot of questions, and we'd really love to see some people attend our course, and if they want to pursue that a little bit more. And outside of Canberra, as I say, if you'd like to contact us, we can look into organising courses in other states as well. But Laurie, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to having you on board with DDLS once again in the near future. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ronnie, and thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Thank you.